Chapter 1. The Unbreakable Bond. The silence was suffocating. The entire pack had gathered in the grand hall of the Alpha's estate, the heavy scent of wood and incense filling the air. But amid the murmurs of anticipation, one figure stood completely still, her heart racing, her mind adrift in a storm of conflicting emotions. She was the Alpha's bride-to-be, the one chosen not by love but by a brutal and unspoken promise, a promise that neither she nor her heart could escape. Amara stood at the threshold of the massive stone doors, her fingers gripping the fabric of her simple gown, her eyes fixed on the stone floor beneath her feet. Every part of her body screamed to run, to flee from the life that had been chosen for her, but her legs wouldn't move. Her heart wouldn't allow it. A silent vow had been made, one that she had been raised to honor. Tonight, the Alpha would claim her. Not with gentleness, not with kindness, but with the strength of a leader who was used to getting what he wanted. No questions asked, no objections raised. But she had questions. Too many to count. Her name was Amara, once a name spoken with affection, now it felt like a distant memory, a relic of who she used to be. Her father's ambition had sold her, packaged her, and presented her as the perfect bride for the Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack. And that was the moment she ceased to be a woman, a daughter, a free spirit. The moment she became the Alpha's silent bride. It was a position that required submission, but not in the way her heart would have desired. She was the Alpha's future, his queen, his mate, his everything. Yet, there was a coldness that ran through the Alpha's veins, a distance in his eyes that she couldn't shake. His name was Rhys, and he was a man whose power was as daunting as the ancient mountains that loomed in the distance. His silent dominance left no room for her voice, no room for her thoughts. She had never spoken to him directly, and he had never bothered to speak to her. There were no stolen glances or shared smiles between them, only the weight of their bond, heavy and unyielding, like a chain around her neck. Her family had been too eager to marry her off, too thrilled by the prospects of the Alpha's power. In their eyes, this was her destiny. But Amara knew better. She knew that a life bound by duty wasn't the life she wanted, that the Alpha's bed would never be a place of tenderness or joy. It would be a battlefield. And so, she remained silent. Silent in her grief. Silent in her despair. Silent in the face of everything she feared. If she couldn't speak, at least she could survive. The doors to the hall opened with a heavy creak, and a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, too imposing. Rhys. The Alpha. His steps were measured, deliberate, echoing in the silence like thunder. The crowd parted as he approached, the air thick with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was their leader, the heart of the pack, the one who commanded their loyalty. His eyes were dark, like midnight itself, sharp with the cold edge of his power. Amara's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't dare look up. The ground beneath her feet felt uneven, but she kept herself steady. His presence alone was enough to shake her to her core, to make her question everything she had ever known. Rhys stopped in front of her, his gaze settling on her form with a quiet intensity. She could feel the heat of his stare, the weight of his unspoken judgment. As though every inch of her was being measured and found wanting. "Amara," he said, his voice deep and smooth, like velvet, but with an underlying authority that made her insides tremble. She couldn't answer him, not that she ever could. The words seemed to lodge themselves in her throat, too heavy to speak. Instead, she lowered her head, offering him the silence that had been her only refuge. He took a step closer, his scent invading her senses. He smelled like the forest after a storm, wild, untamed, dangerous. And yet, there was something else too. Beneath the surface there was a coldness that unnerved her, a disconnection that set her teeth on edge. "You don't have to be afraid," Rhys continued, though his tone suggested it wasn't fear he was referring to. "You're mine now. You don't get to run anymore." The words sliced through her, sharp and unforgiving, confirming what she had always known. She wasn't his bride because he loved her. She was his because of the pact made long before she was born. The bloodlines of their families had been intertwined in this way for generations. And now she was merely a link in the chain, a cog in the machine of power. Her heart thundered, but her lips remained sealed. What was there to say? She had no voice in this, no say in the life that had been forced upon her. But still, as Rhys reached out to touch her, his large hand cupping her chin and tilting her face upward, she found herself unable to look him in the eye. The silent bond between them tugged painfully at her chest, reminding her that she couldn't escape him, not now, not ever. The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken tension between them. She could feel his power, radiating like a storm on the horizon, threatening to overtake her. She had never known fear like this, never understood the kind of control he held over everything, over her. But tonight, everything would change. Rhys leaned down, his breath warm against her ear, sending shivers down her spine. Tonight, you will be mine in every way, he whispered. And you will learn that there is no escape from me. Amara closed her eyes, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She had been silent for so long. But in that moment, she made a vow to herself. No matter how silent she had to be, no matter how much she had to endure, she would not become just another pawn in his kingdom. She would find a way to break free. The Lycan king might have claimed her, but the silent bride would never surrender. Chapter 2. The Hidden Fire. The Alpha's silent bride had been marked for life. But as Amara lay in the cold, empty chamber of the Alpha's private quarters, her mind drifted far from the events that had unfolded just hours earlier. The bed, a vast expanse of silk sheets and fur, felt like an ocean of loneliness. She turned away from the edge, the soft rustle of the fabric the only sound in the otherwise still room. She couldn't sleep. She didn't want to. The night was too long, too quiet, too full of things she couldn't yet understand. She had always known the importance of silence in the Alpha's world. Words were tools of power, but silence was submission. And in this castle, submission was everything. But within her, something began to stir. Something unyielding. Something that couldn't be contained by a man, a title or a pack. Amara knew there was more to her fate than being a mere trophy bride. She had to discover what that was before it was too late. Her fingers clenched into fists beneath the blanket, her heart thundering in her chest as her mind spun with possibilities. She could leave, run away, find her way out of this gilded cage. But she had no idea where she would go. The pack was everywhere. The land was vast and treacherous, and Rhys was not a man who would let her slip away unnoticed. She had been silent for so long, but maybe it was time to change that. Maybe it was time to let the fire inside her burn. Chapter 3. The Silent Defiance. The early morning light crept through the cracks in the heavy curtains, casting a dull glow on the lavish furnishings of the Alpha's private quarters. The room was silent, save for the occasional rustle of fabric as Amara stirred beneath the silken sheets. Her body ached, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of the night's events, the weight of the life that had been thrust upon her without her consent. She had known it would be hard. Every story she had ever heard about the Alpha's weddings, the ceremony of bonding, had painted a picture of dominance, of the Alpha's absolute control over his bride. And yet, as she lay in the bed that now belonged to her, something inside her was stirring, like a sleeping beast slowly waking from a long slumber. The silence of the night had offered her no answers, but it had given her time to think, time to reflect on her choices, or rather, the lack thereof. Her family had sacrificed her to this life. Her father, in his pursuit of power and favor, had offered her as a token to the Alpha Rhys, believing that her marriage to him would secure their place in the hierarchy of the pack. Her mother, ever the obedient wife, had never once questioned the decision. They were content to play the game, to climb the ranks, to reap the rewards of their sacrifices. But Amara wasn't content. She hadn't been content for years, and now, under the suffocating pressure of her new role, she was beginning to realize that she couldn't just accept this fate. The Alpha's world was built on power, on the submission of those around him. His pack obeyed without question, his will bending the world around him to his whims. He ruled with an iron fist, and in his world, there was no room for weakness, no room for disobedience. And yet, in the quiet of her room, with the weight of his claim heavy upon her, Amara was forced to confront the truth. Her silence would not be enough. Rhys had claimed her in a way that left no room for doubt. His presence had filled the room with the power of his pack, and his touch, cold, commanding, unwavering, had left an indelible mark on her soul. His silence had been an unspoken agreement, a reminder of who controlled whom. But as the night had worn on and the promise of the bond settled into her skin like a tattoo, Amara's resolve had begun to solidify. She would not be a pawn in his game. She would not be silenced by his authority. She would break free. As the day began to unfold, Amara rose from the bed, the silk sheets falling away from her pale form. She moved slowly, deliberately, her every step calculated. She had to be careful. The pack was always watching, their eyes ever present. But the fire inside her had begun to burn hotter, and it was a fire that refused to be ignored. She pulled on the simple dress she had been given upon arrival, its material rough compared to the silks she had grown accustomed to. It was a reminder of what she was, and what she wasn't. She wasn't a queen. Not yet, anyway. She wasn't a ruler of men, nor a figurehead who could wield power with a smile and a wave. She was merely the Alpha's silent bride, a title bestowed upon her by the men who had chosen her path. But she wasn't just that. She was more than that. The room she stood in felt both foreign and familiar at the same time, the intricately carved furniture and lavish tapestries a reflection of the wealth and power that had surrounded her since birth. But for the first time, she saw it for what it truly was, a gilded cage, a prison disguised as luxury. Her gaze lingered on the window, the glass slightly fogged from the warmth inside, and, through the mist, she could see the distant hills that bordered the Alpha's estate. The land stretched out before her, endless and untamed, much like the feelings that churned in her chest. She turned her back to the view and set about preparing herself for the day. Amara had learned early on the value of composure. Her training had been a rigid one. Her lessons on the importance of silence and submission ingrained in her from a young age. But there was another lesson she had learned, one that had been buried beneath the layers of obedience and duty. The lesson of survival. And today, survival meant something different. It meant stepping into the world of the Alpha, not as his bride but as something more. Something that would not be easily controlled. She moved toward the door, her fingers brushing against the cool wood of the frame. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it was not fear that quickened her pulse. It was something else, something deeper, darker. She was about to walk into the lion's den. But this time, she would not be a lamb. Chapter 4, The Alpha's Command. The hallways of the Alpha's estate were eerily quiet as Amara walked toward the grand dining hall, the weight of the pack's gaze following her every step. They all knew who she was, who she had become. The Alpha's silent bride, the future queen. But none of them knew what she was planning. None of them knew the storm that was beginning to form within her, gathering strength with every breath she took. She could feel their eyes on her, their whispers at the edges of her hearing. She could hear the faint rustling of conversations, the quick glances cast her way as she passed. Amara was well aware of the position she now held. Every move she made was under scrutiny. Every glance, every gesture, was analyzed. She was no longer just Amara. She was the Alpha's possession. And that was precisely why she couldn't stay silent any longer. As she entered the dining hall, the room fell silent. The Alpha was already seated at the head of the table, his presence looming over the others like a shadow. His eyes met hers immediately. Dark and unyielding, she had grown accustomed to his stare, but today it felt different. Today there was a challenge in his gaze, something she hadn't seen before. "You're late," Rhys said, his voice cold, commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice for his presence to fill the room. Every word from him carried weight, every syllable a reminder of the power he wielded. Amara stood at the threshold of the room, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on the floor. But inside, a fire was rising. The air in the room seemed to thicken with every passing second. The other pack members sat at the long table, their eyes darting between. The two of them, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. "Forgive me, Alpha," she said softly, her voice steady, though it trembled ever so slightly. It was a tone she had mastered over the years, one that conveyed both respect and distance. But today, It felt hollow. Rhys raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving hers. He studied her for a moment, as though weighing her words. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. "No need to apologize," he replied, his tone casual, as though the words carried no weight. "But you will learn that punctuality is important here, Amara. In this pack, we do not waste time." She nodded, though the words stung. They were meant to. Rhys had never been one to coddle her with kindness. But she would not let his words break her. Not today. "I understand," she said, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. The moment their eyes locked, something shifted between them, a silent understanding, a flicker of something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore. But just as quickly the moment passed, and Rhys leaned forward, signaling for the servants to bring in the food. The meal, though lavish, felt like little more than a formality. Another piece in the ritual that bound her to him. She sat at his side, the distance between them palpable, and though she ate in silence, her mind was far away. She could feel Rhys's eyes on her, the weight of his scrutiny like a physical presence in the room. But it wasn't just him. The pack, too, was watching, waiting to see what would unfold between the Alpha and his bride. But Amara wasn't interested in their expectations. She wasn't interested in playing the role they had assigned to her. As the meal came to an end, Rhys stood, his movements fluid, graceful, like a predator poised to strike. He turned to her, his gaze darkening once more. "It's time," he said simply, his voice low, commanding. Amara stood as well, her heart pounding, but her resolve steady. It was time to face him. But this time, she would not be the silent bride. Chapter 5. Breaking the Silence. Amara followed Rhys out of the dining hall, her steps deliberate but heavy. The moment she entered the Alpha's private chambers, the door closing behind them with a soft thud, she felt the air shift. The walls of this room, like everything else in his estate, were imposing, lined with dark wood and thick velvet drapes, heavy with the weight of history. Rhys turned to face her, his eyes burning with intensity. "You've been silent long enough," he said, his voice low, but filled with the command of someone who had never known resistance. Amara didn't flinch. This was her moment. "I've been silent because I had no voice," she replied, her voice stronger now, more confident. "But that changes today." Rhys's expression darkened, his jaw tightening in a way that made her heart race. "You will learn," he warned, his voice almost a growl, "that your silence is not a choice." Amara lifted her chin, her eyes never leaving his. "Then perhaps it's time for you to learn that I'm no longer yours to control." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. Rhys stood still, his eyes flickering with something Amara couldn't quite place, surprise perhaps, or maybe something darker. But whatever it was enough to make her realize one thing: the silent bride was no longer silent. And neither was the Alpha. Chapter 6. The Alpha's Fury. The room was thick with tension. The heavy dark velvet curtains in the Alpha's private chambers did little to soften the light streaming in from the moon. The pale ghostly glow bathed the room in an eerie light, reflecting off the polished wood floors, the intricate tapestries, and the cold stone walls that surrounded them. Amara's heart was thundering in her chest, her breath shallow as she stood before Rhys, her body still but her mind racing. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when silence would no longer be her prison, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous. Rhys's presence loomed over her like a storm, the power that radiated from him enough to make her body hum with awareness. He was no longer just the Alpha. He was the embodiment of everything she had been taught to fear. Everything. That had been drilled into her as the truth of this world. And yet, she stood her ground. The silence stretched on between them, thick and oppressive, until Rhys's voice shattered it like a whip's crack. "You think you have control here?" he asked, his voice low, smooth, dangerous. His words weren't a question, they were a challenge. Amara's gaze didn't falter. She had spent too long under the weight of his power, too long in his shadow, to let his words shake her now. She had learned the hard way that silence could be a weapon, but now, she had a voice. She had a choice. I think it's time you realize that I never belonged to you, Amara replied, her voice steady, though the words felt like they came from a place she hadn't known existed inside her. Not in the way you've always believed. Rhys's eyes narrowed, his jaw tight with the force of his restraint. His massive form stood still as a mountain, but there was a tension in his posture, a crack in his control that she could feel. For a brief moment, the mask of the Alpha slipped, and she saw something in him that startled her, a flicker of uncertainty, a trace of something far more human than she had ever expected. But it was fleeting. The moment passed as quickly as it came, and Rhys took a step forward, closing the distance between them in a way that made her heart race. His presence was overwhelming, a force of nature she could feel in every fiber of her being. You think you can defy me? His voice was softer now, dangerous in its intimacy. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch searing as though he could burn her from the inside out. His touch had always been like this, sharp, possessive, claiming. But today, she didn't pull away. Instead, she met his gaze, her heart pounding, but her resolve hardening with each passing second. I don't need to defy you, Rhys. I just need you to understand that I am not yours to command. The words left her lips with a clarity that surprised even her. It was as if the fire that had been smoldering inside her for so long had finally found its voice, its strength. And she wasn't about to back down now. For the first time since she had arrived at the Alpha's estate, Amara saw something shift in Rhys's eyes. His expression softened, but there was a hardness behind it, a flicker of something dark and primal that she couldn't quite place. You are mine, he said, his voice a low growl. You will always be mine, whether you accept it or not. Amara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin, her posture strong, unyielding. No, she said firmly, her voice filled with the weight of her defiance. Not anymore. The room seemed to grow colder, the tension between them palpable. Rhys stood motionless for a moment, his gaze unblinking, as though he were measuring her, calculating her every word, every action. He was the Alpha, and his presence commanded the room, but for the first time, Amara didn't feel the overwhelming weight of his dominance. She felt something else, the raw, undeniable truth of her own strength. He took a deep breath, the air between them crackling with power. Before he spoke again, his voice quieter, though no less dangerous. You don't understand what you're saying, Amara. You don't understand what it means to challenge me. Amara's pulse quickened, but she didn't let the fear that threatened to rise creep into her voice. Maybe I don't, she said, her words a challenge, a declaration of her own power. But I'm not afraid of you. Rhys stared at her for a long moment, and in that time, Amara could feel the conflict in him. He was the Alpha, the leader of the pack, the one who had been bred for power and control. But even he was human. Even he had limits. Afraid? Rhys repeated, a soft laugh escaping his lips. But it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of disbelief, of something far darker. You should be, Amara. The words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Amara's heart was pounding in her chest, but she stood tall, refusing to let her fear show. She had spent too long hiding, too long letting him control her thoughts, her emotions. She had allowed herself to become a pawn in his game. But not anymore. I'm not afraid of what you'll do to me, she said softly, though her words were sharp, cutting through the silence between them like a blade. I'm afraid of what I'll become if I stay here. For a moment, Rhys said nothing. The room felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, he took a step back, his gaze never leaving hers. You'll become what you were always meant to be, he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. Mine? Amara shook her head, the fire inside her burning hotter, fiercer. She could feel the bond between them, the connection that had been forged through blood, through their families, through the years of silence and submission. It was strong, unbreakable, but not invincible. No, she said again, her voice unwavering. Not anymore. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. It stretched between them, thick and heavy, until finally, Rhys spoke again, his voice low, almost regretful. You will regret this, he said, his eyes darkening with something far more dangerous than anger. "You'll regret defying me, Amara. You'll regret ever thinking you could escape what we are." Amara didn't flinch. She couldn't. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet defiance. "But at least I'll be free." For a long moment, Rhys stood in silence, his eyes narrowing as though he were weighing her words, considering them. And then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door. "Remember this, Amara," he said, his voice cold, final. "You cannot escape what is meant to be." As he left the room, the door slamming behind him with a heavy thud, Amara stood still, her body trembling with the aftermath of their confrontation. The fire inside her hadn't died. It had only grown stronger. She wasn't just his silent bride anymore. She was a woman, a force, a rebellion waiting to be unleashed. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would never again be silenced by the Alpha, or anyone else. Chapter 7. The Storm Inside. The next few days felt like an eternity. The tension between Amara and Rhys was palpable, hanging thick in the air like an approaching storm. She could feel the weight of it in every room she entered, every glance that was cast her way. The pack watched them closely, waiting for something, anything to break. But Amara was determined to stand her ground. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to back down now. She spent her days walking the grounds of the estate, the cold wind biting at her skin, but it did little to cool the fire that burned inside her. She refused to stay in the quiet gilded cage Rhys had created for her. She refused to let him control her. The forest surrounding the estate seemed to beckon her, its vast expanse offering the freedom she had longed for. But even as she stood at the edge of the trees, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she could never truly escape, she felt the pull of Rhys's presence. He was always there, watching, waiting, and for the first time in her life, Amara knew that she had to face him. She had to face the Alpha who had claimed her, the man who had made her a silent bride. But she was done being silent. The storm was coming, and she would be the one to bring it. Chapter 8. The Echo of Power. The moon was full again, casting its pale silver glow over the sprawling grounds of the estate. The pack was restless tonight, their howls echoing across the forest as the air thickened with anticipation. Amara stood at the edge of the grand balcony, her hand gripping the railing as the wind whipped through her hair. The cold was biting, but it didn't matter. The chill she felt wasn't from the night air. It was from the silent war waging inside her. Every part of her longed to break free, to run and never look back. The vast, dark forest called to her, whispering promises of freedom, of a life not defined by chains of duty and blood. But that freedom always felt like it was just out of reach. Every time she moved, every time she made a decision to change the course of her life, she felt the pull of Rhys's influence, like invisible strings tethering her to the world of power and control he ruled over. She had to stop thinking like this. Stop being torn between the life she had been forced into and the life she wanted to create for herself. She couldn't afford to be indecisive anymore. Her mind kept returning to their last conversation. No, their last confrontation. Rhys's words had been like a shadow, hovering over her with the promise of regret, the reminder of the power he wielded over her. But she refused to believe them. She refused to be afraid. And yet, there was a voice in the back of her mind. A voice she couldn't silence. It was the voice of doubt, of fear, of the unknown. What if she was wrong? What if defying Rhys was the mistake she would regret for the rest of her life? She shook her head violently, forcing the thoughts away. She would not let him control her. Not anymore. The sound of footsteps behind her made her stiffen, and for a split second, her heart skipped a beat. But then she recognized the presence, felt the weight of it before even turning. Rhys was here. She didn't need to see him to know that he had come to claim her again, to remind her of her place in his world. Amara. His voice was like a growl, low and demanding, a force of nature she could never ignore. She turned slowly, not wanting to show him how much his presence affected her. His eyes, dark and brooding, bore into her with that intensity that made her heart race, even when she wanted to feel nothing at all. "You've been avoiding me," he said, taking a step closer, his towering figure casting a long shadow over her. His gaze was unwavering, as if he were daring her to respond. "I'm not avoiding you," she said quietly, her voice measured, but firm. "I'm simply taking time to think." He smirked, a cruel twist of his lips that only deepened the tension between them. "You think too much, Amara. It doesn't suit you." Her heart pounded as the words hit her like a slap. She wasn't sure whether it was the sting of his dismissal, or the truth in his statement that made her blood boil. She had been thinking, yes, thinking about everything. About him, about the pack, about the life she had been born into, and the life she was trying to build. But thinking wouldn't change anything. "I don't need your permission to think, Rhys," she retorted, her voice stronger now. "I don't need your permission for anything." His smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a sharp look that made her pulse spike. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, until they were standing face to face. His presence enveloped her, filling every inch of space around her. "You think you're in control here?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "You think you can defy me and face no consequences?" She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Her silence had been her only shield for so long, but silence wasn't going to save her anymore. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I'm in control, but I think I have a right to choose what happens to me." Rhys's gaze darkened, and the tension in the room thickened. The air between them crackled with something far more powerful than the words they were exchanging. It was the power of the bond they shared, the unspoken promise that had been sealed the day she was born into this world. "You're mine," he said, his voice rough with something that felt dangerously close to possessiveness. "I've claimed you, Amara. And you will not walk away from that, not now. Not ever." Her chest tightened at his words, a rush of emotions flooding through her. Anger, frustration, fear. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something far darker. The bond between them, no matter how much she wished to sever it, still tugged at her heart, pulling her closer to him. No matter how much she resisted, no matter how fiercely she fought to maintain her independence, she knew deep down that part of her still belonged to him. But that didn't mean she had to accept it. "I'm not your possession, Rhys," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I never was, and I never will be." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Amara stood her ground, her heart racing, her body tense with the weight of everything that had been said. Rhys's expression was unreadable, his eyes flicking over her as though trying to gauge her reaction. But this time, she didn't look away. For the first time in their relationship, she wasn't afraid of him. Rhys let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with the force of it. He stepped back slightly, though his presence still loomed over her like a shadow. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice low, but the edge of danger still present. "You may not be my possession, but you are mine. And I don't take kindly to being defied." "I'm not afraid of you," she said, the words surprising her as they slipped from her lips. For a moment she almost regretted them. But then she looked into his eyes, and the fear she had once felt began to fade, replaced by something far stronger, determination. Rhys's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, something almost human flickering in his eyes. But before she could make sense of it, he turned away, his back to her, his posture stiff. "You should be," he muttered, his voice cold as he made his way toward the door. "But fine. Defy me. You will learn the consequences soon enough." Amara stood in the silence that followed, her heart hammering in her chest. The storm inside her was only just beginning, but she knew without a doubt that she would never back down. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 9. The Breaking Point. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and silence. Rhys kept his distance, though his eyes were always on her, watching her every move. He was waiting for her to break, to return to her place by his side, to accept the life he had set out for her. But Amara wasn't going to break. She couldn't. She spent her days wandering the estate, the vast grounds surrounding the pack's home offering a strange sense of freedom. But even then she could feel the weight of Rhys's presence, lurking just beyond the horizon, like a shadow that never quite let go. It was as if he were everywhere, his influence seeping into every corner of the estate, every hallway, every room. It was the power of an alpha, the power of a king who ruled with silence and strength. And yet, for all his power, for all the authority he commanded, Amara knew something Rhys didn't. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Her days were spent in quiet rebellion. She refused to fall back into the routine of obedience that had been drilled into her since childhood. She would no longer be the silent bride. She would no longer be a pawn in his game. But the more she resisted, the more she felt the pull of their bond. The tug at her heart, the ache in her chest that told her Rhys was never far away. The bond they shared, whether she wanted it or not, was real. And as much as she hated it, as much as she fought against it, part of her still longed for him. And that scared her more than anything. The battle between her heart and her mind raged on. But Amara refused to let Rhys have the final word. That was when the rebels arrived. Their presence was known long before they crossed the borders of the estate. The pack could feel it, the tension, the anxiety, the unmistakable scent of enemies on the horizon. And when Rhys called the pack to arms, Amara knew deep down that this was the moment that would change everything. The battle for her freedom had only just begun. Chapter 10: The Wolf's Roar. The sounds of the rebels' approach stirred the air like the crackling of dry wood before a fire. Rhys had not spoken of the enemy's tactics directly, but Amara could feel the undercurrent of unrest building with every passing hour. The Alpha's commands had already been issued, and the pack, loyal and deadly, was preparing for what could very well be a war unlike any other they had fought. The estate, which had once seemed like a fortress of indomitable strength, now felt exposed, vulnerable. Amara stood at the window, staring out at the horizon, watching as the trees swayed gently in the wind, unaware of the impending chaos. It was strange how quiet it all seemed when the world was on the brink of war. The stillness felt almost like an omen. Her thoughts were disrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the grand hallway outside. She recognized the stride immediately. Rhys? Amara turned to face the door just as it opened, and Rhys stepped into the room. His presence filled the space immediately, casting a shadow over her, both literal and figurative. His eyes, dark and stormy, met hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter involuntarily. He said nothing at first, his gaze assessing her as if trying to decipher her thoughts, her feelings before he spoke. "You're still here," he said, his voice low, almost in disbelief. Amara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deliberate step toward the center of the room, her movements controlled, calm, though her heart was far from either. She had to stand her ground. She had to show him that she was no longer the silent, obedient bride he expected her to be. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied quietly, her voice steady, despite the racing of her pulse. "The rebels are coming, aren't they?" Rhys's lips twitched upward in the faintest of smiles. "You're more perceptive than I thought," he said, stepping closer to her, his figure imposing and almost suffocating. The power he exuded was undeniable. But Amara stood firm, refusing to step back. "Your pack is preparing for battle. I can feel it." She paused, her gaze holding his as she spoke. "I know that the rebels aren't just a threat to the pack. They're a threat to everything." Rhys's expression hardened at her words, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the Alpha slipped. His eyes darkened, and the weight of the world seemed to hang heavily on his shoulders. "You don't know what you're saying, Amara," he said quietly, almost too softly. "You don't understand the consequences of what's coming. The rebellion is not just a fight for power, it's a fight for survival." She raised an eyebrow. "Survival? Are you talking about the pack, or are you talking about yourself?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Amara watched as Rhys's gaze flickered, just for a moment, to something unreadable, something hidden beneath the surface of the strong, confident Alpha. But he quickly masked it, stepping toward her, closing the distance. His voice was sharper now but still low. "The pack's survival is my responsibility. It always has been. You may not understand this world, but I do. I've bled for this pack. I've killed for it. Everything I do for them. And now, I have to protect what's mine." She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a stone. He wasn't just the leader of the pack. He wasn't just an alpha. He was a man with a burden so heavy that it threatened to crush him under its weight. She could feel that in the very air between them, and for the first time, she began to see him differently. "I'm not one of your pack members, Rhys," Amara said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm not just another piece on your chessboard." His jaw clenched at her words, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more. But then, he merely exhaled sharply, his gaze shifting as though something inside him had broken. "You never understood the bond, did you?" Rhys said, his voice suddenly hollow, almost regretful. He moved back toward the window, staring out at the estate. "The bond between us, it's not just physical, it's not just about a title or a role to be played. It's fate, Amara. We are bound by something older than either of us. You don't see it yet, but one day, you will." The silence between them felt like an eternity. Amara was still, her heart hammering in her chest, the weight of his words pressing against her like a constant reminder of the power he wielded over her life. "I'm not afraid of fate, Rhys," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of you. I never was." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw the Alpha as something more than just a ruler, a king whose crown was built on dominance and fear. She saw him as a man, as someone who had fought for his place in this world, who had sacrificed everything to protect those he loved. And that, in its own way, made him dangerous. But not invincible. The room was silent again, the air thick with unspoken words, until Rhys finally spoke, his tone colder now. "You will be afraid, Amara. You will be afraid when you see what I'm willing to do to protect this pack." Her heart skipped a beat, but she refused to let the fear show. She would not let him intimidate her. "I will never be afraid of you, Rhys," she said, stepping closer to him. The space between them was electric, charged with the intensity of their unspoken bond. Not anymore. The silence between them stretched, both of them standing there, locked in an unspoken battle. And yet, despite the tension, Amara could feel something shift within her. The power that had once seemed to belong solely to Rhys, now felt like something she could take back. Her heart, once bound by duty, was no longer a prisoner to the Alpha's will. She had a voice. She had a choice, and Rhys would soon learn that she would no longer stand idly by. Chapter 11, The First Strike. The sounds of war were closer now. Amara could hear the distant calls of the pack preparing for battle, their howls echoing across the land, like wolves ready to tear into the unknown. The rebels had come, and the pack was ready to face them. But for Amara, the war had already begun. She stood in the center of the estate's courtyard, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her heart beat a furious rhythm in her chest, but it wasn't the battle that had her on edge. It was the weight of the decision she had made. Rhys had been right about one thing. The rebellion was not just a fight for power. It was a fight for survival. But what he didn't realize was that Amara was no longer willing to fight for a life that was not hers. She wasn't going to be the pawn in his battle. She wasn't going to stand idly by and watch him control everything around her. The pack was gathering, the warriors lining up in formation, preparing for what they knew would be a brutal confrontation. Their eyes were fierce, determined, ready to fight and die for the pack, for their Alpha. But Amara's thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't ignore the rebellion, the threat that loomed over them, but she also couldn't ignore the truth that had been planted deep inside her for so long. The truth that no one, not even Rhys, had ever wanted her to see. She was her own person. And that meant she had choices. Her fingers brushed against the hilt of the dagger hidden at her side. It was small, unassuming, but deadly. Her heart thudded in her chest, the decision weighing on her as though it might break her in two. And then, she heard it. The howl of a wolf, loud and piercing. The rebels were here. Her eyes shifted to the pack, and there, standing at the front, was Rhys, towering, commanding, his eyes locked on the horizon, waiting for the first strike. But Amara had already made her decision. She turned away from the crowd, slipping into the shadows of the estate's outer gardens, her heart pounding as she moved silently through the trees. Her escape would not be easy, it would not be painless. But she had to go. She had to find a way to break free. Her legs burned as she ran, pushing herself faster than she ever had before. She could feel Rhys's presence in the back of her mind, like a shadow that would never leave her. But tonight, she was running toward freedom. She wasn't running away from the rebellion. She was running toward something else, something more important than power, than bloodlines, than a man who could never truly understand her. She was running toward her future, and she would fight for it, no matter the cost. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. Amara stumbled through the dense woods, her breath ragged in the cool night air. The sounds of the battle still rang in the distance, but they were fading. Each step she took away from the estate, away from Rhys and the pack, felt like a small victory. But her victory was short-lived. The brush around her parted with a snap, and before she could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was him. Rhys? She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "You won't get away from me, Amara," he said, his voice low, dangerous. His figure was outlined by the pale light of the moon, his gaze locked on hers with that same unyielding intensity. Her pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "I have to, Rhys," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not yours. Not anymore." He took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. "You can't escape me. You can't escape what we are." And in that moment she realized, this wasn't just about the pack. This wasn't just about power. This was about them, the bond between them that neither of them could escape. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't need to run anymore. Chapter 13. The Shattered Bond. The cold night air clung to Amara's skin as she stared at Rhys, standing mere feet away, his towering presence casting an almost suffocating shadow over her. The moon, now high in the sky, shone its cold light over the clearing, making the trees appear like twisted skeletal figures. Despite the chill, Amara's body burned with a mixture of adrenaline and defiance. Her heart hammered in her chest, but not out of fear. No. This was something else entirely. This was a moment of choice, of freedom, and she would not shrink from it. Rhys's eyes, dark as the night itself, locked onto hers with an intensity that could have shattered anyone else. He took a step closer, his movements measured and calculated, like a predator sizing up its prey. His body radiated strength, power, everything she had been taught to respect, even fear. But tonight, she felt no fear. Not anymore. The years of silence, of submission, had built up to this moment, and now, she would break the chains that had kept her tied to him. "You think you can run?" Rhys's voice, though calm, was tinged with a warning. It was a low growl, one that sent shivers through the air. "You think you can leave and escape the bond between us? What we are, Amara, is not something you can walk away from." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She held his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. "What we are," she said softly, "is a lie." The words were like a slap to the face. The bond, the claim, the force of Rhys's power over her. It had always been one-sided, one that she had been forced to accept. But now, standing before him, she realized something that shook her to the core. The bond between them was not just something he had imposed on her. It had been a creation of their shared history, of their family's ambitions, of destiny, of blood, and of control. But it wasn't her destiny. "It's not a lie," Rhys said, his voice hardening as he took another step forward. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet as his energy shifted, filling the space around them. His power, his presence, was overwhelming. He was the Alpha, the king of the pack. His dominance was unyielding. But even as he closed the distance between them, Amara refused to be intimidated. "It is," she whispered, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "You never gave me a choice, Rhys. You never even let me see who I could be without you. You trapped me, controlled me, and you made me believe that I had no power, that I had no voice." Rhys's expression faltered, just for a second. The flicker of something softer, something almost human, crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the stoic mask of the Alpha, the man who had always been in control. "You will never understand," he said quietly, the words like a confession. "You think I enjoy this? You think I wanted to make you a prisoner of fate? His voice grew heavier, more strained. I never asked for this either, Amara, but I've learned to live with it. I've learned to accept that this is how it has to be, that we are bound together by something greater than us both. Amara shook her head, a fierce determination rising within her. No. You've learned to control it, to control me. Her pulse quickened as she stepped back, her chest tight with emotion. The weight of his words hung in the air, but they didn't shake her resolve. She had never been more certain that her freedom, her autonomy, was worth the battle. She swallowed the lump in her throat, fighting back the tears that threatened to surface. I won't be your pawn any longer, Rhys. I won't live the life you've chosen for me. I am not your future. I am not your queen, your possession, your anything. There was a long silence between them, thick with tension. Rhys stood still, his eyes locked onto hers. His jaw clenched, as if fighting with himself, battling with the storm inside him. And in that moment, Amara saw it, the crack in his armor. The vulnerability he had been hiding from her for so long. He took another step toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. His presence was like a storm waiting to break, but this time, Amara stood her ground. Do you really think you can escape this? Rhys's voice was low, but there was a sadness in it now. Do you really think you can walk away from everything we've built? From everything I've sacrificed? She opened her mouth to speak, but he stopped her with a single look. You think this bond is a choice for me too? That it's something I've wanted? His words came out in a rough, almost pained whisper. I didn't want this life, Amara. I didn't want to be the Alpha. I didn't want to rule this pack, to be the king of this world, but it was thrust upon me. And so was this bond between us. Amara's heart wavered. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the anguish that had been buried beneath his unshakable facade for so long. She had never seen him like this. So raw, so vulnerable. But even as the softness flickered in his gaze, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay. She couldn't accept the life he had forced upon her, no matter how much she understood his struggle. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving his. I'm not your burden, Rhys. And I won't be your prison. The pain in his eyes deepened, and for a moment the Alpha, the king, seemed to falter. But then, just as quickly, the hardness returned. His shoulders squared, his jaw clenched, and his expression became unreadable again. You don't understand what you're saying, he murmured, though his voice was laced with an almost desperate edge. This isn't just about us. It's about everything. The pack, the kingdom, my duty, your duty. I never asked for this duty, Amara retorted, her voice stronger now, more certain. I never asked to be your queen. Your mate, your future. Then what do you want? Rhys asked, his voice a low growl, a challenge in his tone. Amara's heart beat louder in her chest. She took a deep breath and for the first time, let herself speak her truth. I want my life back. I want to choose my own path. I want to be free. The silence that followed felt like 1,000 years. Rhys stared at her, his eyes narrowing as though he were trying to understand her, to comprehend her words. The Alpha, the king, the man who had held everything in his hands, seemed at a loss. And in that moment, Amara saw the truth of what she had known for so long. She was not a part of his kingdom. She was not a piece in his game. She was a woman, one who had the right to choose her own fate. Leave, Rhys said quietly, the words rough, as if they had been dragged from his throat. If you think you can leave, then go. But know this, you can never truly escape me. Not now, not ever. The finality in his voice, the coldness, sent a shiver down her spine. But Amara didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She had made her decision, and she wasn't going to let anything, least of all him, stop her. I don't need to escape you, she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a strength that surprised even her. I just need to be free. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps steady as she moved toward the woods. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The bond between them would always be there, like a tether pulling at her heart, but she would never again let it control her. She was free. Chapter 14. The Escape. The forest was dark, its shadows thick with the weight of the night. Amara moved through it like a shadow herself, her footsteps light but purposeful. She had escaped. She had finally made it out of the estate, out of Rhys's world. But now that she was free, the question was, what now? Her heart still pounded in her chest. But it wasn't from fear. It was from the exhilaration of defying the life she had been trapped in for so long. For the first time she felt alive, truly alive. But the further she walked into the forest, the more her mind raced with what lay ahead. She had no plan, no direction. She only knew that she couldn't stay in the pack's territory. She couldn't remain under Rhys's shadow. She needed to find her own path, her own future. The sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, expecting to see the Alpha. To see him following her, as he always did. As he always would. But it wasn't Rhys. It was someone else. Her breath caught in her throat, as the figure stepped into the dim light of the clearing. His eyes glinted in the darkness, familiar and dangerous. Darius. The rogue Lycan who had once fought for Rhys. The one who had disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing but whispers in his wake. Amara, Darius said, his voice low, almost soothing. You didn't think you could escape, did you? Amara's heart hammered in her chest. The air around her grew thick with tension, but she refused to show fear. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. Why are you here? She demanded, her voice shaking with uncertainty. Darius stepped closer, his movements fluid, graceful. He was a predator. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. But there was something else in his eyes. Something darker. Something that told her he wasn't here just to catch her. I'm here to help, he said, his tone almost kind, though there was an edge to it. And you'll need all the help you can get. Amara's mind raced, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. Not yet. The truth of her escape was still settling over her, and now, with Darius here, things were about to get even more complicated. She wasn't safe yet. Not by a long shot. Chapter 15. The Unlikely Ally. Amara stood frozen, her pulse racing as she locked eyes with Darius. The rogue Lycan, once a trusted member of Rhys's pack, now stood in front of her as a stranger, a threat perhaps. Or maybe something else, she couldn't decide. He had the air of someone who had lived through enough betrayal, enough survival, to know what was worth fighting for, and what was simply a lost cause. But what could he want with her? She wasn't sure she could trust him. Her mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts. He was a rogue, and she had no idea where his loyalties lay. He had once been part of Rhys's pack, yet here he was, offering his help. But why? What do you want, Darius? Amara's voice was steady, though she felt the weight of his gaze on her, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Why would you help me? Darius's lips curled into a faint, almost bitter smile, but there was no humor in it. His eyes gleamed, cold yet intense, his presence unsettling in a way that made her skin prickle. You're running, he said simply, his voice calm, almost conversational. And I know why. Amara's eyebrows furrowed, suspicion running through her like a dark current. Do you? Because I don't think anyone really knows why I'm running. Darius stepped closer, his tall frame looming over her. He was dangerous. There was no denying that. But there was something else in his expression, something that suggested understanding. Or perhaps, manipulation. Amara couldn't tell. Rhys doesn't know everything, he continued, his voice soft, persuasive. Neither do you. You think your escape is about freedom, but it's about survival. The pack is on the verge of war, and not just with the rebels. There are others, Amara. There's a bigger game at play here. The cold air around them thickened, swirling like a prelude to a storm, as Darius's words settled over her like a veil. The tension in her chest tightened. What do you mean? He moved around her, keeping his eyes on her at all times, his voice never rising above a murmur. You're the key to all of it. Rhys knows this, and so do I. That's why he won't let you go, not willingly. He's bound by this bloodline, this legacy that neither of you can outrun. But you... He paused, turning to face her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. You have the power to break it. Amara's heart stilled. The words felt heavy in her chest, like they were sinking into her bones. What are you talking about? She barely whispered the words, the enormity of what he was suggesting starting to take root. Darius's eyes darkened, and his voice lowered even further. You're the last of the blood moonline, Amara. The last of an ancient bloodline that can break the curse. The same curse that binds Rhys. The curse that governs the Lycans. The very bond you're tied to. If you can sever it, you can free yourself. You can free the pack. You can end the war. The weight of his words crashed down on her. Her thoughts, which had once been sharp and clear, now felt fractured. She had always known there was more to her than just being Rhys's bride. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Why are you telling me this? She asked, the question raw with uncertainty. Why do you care? Darius took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. Because I've seen the destruction this bond causes. I've seen it in Rhys, I've seen it in the pack. They're all slaves to it just like you were. But you, Amara, you have the power to break it, and that's why I'm here. Amara shook her head, trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. It felt impossible, too far-fetched to believe. You want me to destroy everything, to tear apart the only world I've ever known, to break the pack, break Rhys? Darius's face softened, his voice becoming quieter, more insistent. It's not about destruction, Amara. It's about freedom. It's about breaking the chains that bind all of you. You're not the only one trapped in this game. Rhys, the pack, they all suffer because of this bond. But you are the one who can end it. Amara stood there, motionless, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and possibility. Could she really do it? Could she truly sever the bond? Could she free herself from Rhys? And the pack? You're not the only one who has suffered, Darius continued, stepping closer to her, his voice low and compelling. Rhys won't tell you this, but he has his own demons. He has been bound to this curse longer than you can imagine. But you... He paused, his gaze intense as it locked with hers. You can free him too. You can free everyone. Her heart ached at his words. The thought of freeing Rhys, of giving him the freedom he'd never had, was an impossible thought. Yet there was something in Darius's voice, a certain conviction, that made her believe he wasn't lying. For the first time since her escape, Amara's resolve began to shift. She wasn't just running from Rhys anymore. She wasn't just trying to escape her fate. She was choosing to fight for something bigger than herself. Darius held out his hand, the movement slow and deliberate. I can show you the way. You don't have to do this alone. Amara hesitated, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. She had no plan, no direction. She had nothing but the raw desire for freedom, the kind of freedom she had never believed possible. But Darius had just shown her a way. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for his. For the first time since her life had been turned upside down, she felt the spark of something different, something beyond survival. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. Show me what to do. Chapter 16. The Final Choice. The wind howled through the trees as Amara and Darius made their way deeper into the forest. The pack's estate was far behind them now, a distant memory fading with every step they took. They were no longer part of that world. They were heading into the unknown, toward a future neither of them could predict. But as they walked in silence, Amara's heart felt heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. She had chosen a path that could change everything. The power to break the bond. To end the curse. Her mind kept returning to Rhys. To the man she had once thought she could love. To the man who had claimed her as his bride. Who had bound her to him in ways she could never escape. But now, as the wind whipped through her hair and the shadows of the trees stretched long around her, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Was breaking the bond the right thing to do? Was it worth it? Darius was walking just ahead of her, his back straight, his eyes scanning the horizon as though he already knew where they were headed. She couldn't help but wonder how much of this he had already planned. How much of it was just a game to him? Where are we going? She asked, her voice breaking the silence that had enveloped them for miles. Darius glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. To the old temple, he said quietly. It's hidden in the heart of the forest. It's the only place where the bond can be severed. The temple? She repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion. What temple? I've never heard of it. Few have, Darius replied. It's ancient, forgotten. But it holds the key. The magic that can break the curse that binds you to Rhys. Amara's thoughts swirled. She had heard whispers of old temples and forgotten magic, but they were just stories, myths passed down through the generations. Could there really be a way to sever the bond? Could she really be free? But even as the questions filled her mind, she knew one thing for certain: she was willing to try. And so, they walked on. The journey took hours, the dense forest pressing in around them. But Amara felt no fear. She felt no hesitation. She was ready for whatever came next. She had made her decision. She had chosen her own path. The clearing appeared suddenly, as though it had been waiting for them all along. In the center stood the ancient temple, its stone walls overgrown with vines and moss, the faded carvings of old magic etched deep into the stone. The air felt different here, charged, almost electric. Amara stepped forward, her heart racing with anticipation. This was it. The moment of truth. Darius stood beside her, his eyes scanning the temple's entrance. "This is where it ends, Amara," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "This is where the bond breaks." Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, her hand trembling as she reached for the ancient markings on the stone. She could feel it, something ancient, something powerful pulsing beneath the surface. And then, with a single sharp breath, she began. The magic that had bound her to Rhys for so long began to unravel, the threads of fate that had tied them together slowly and painfully breaking apart. The pain was sharp, searing through her body. But she didn't pull away. She couldn't. This was the price of her freedom. And with the final, shuddering gasp, the bond between them broke. She was free. Chapter 17. The Dawn of a New World. The night had fallen quiet once more, the air still with the absence of the bond that had once bound Amara to Rhys. The magic in the temple had worked, and she had felt it, the bond snapping, the connection severed. For the first time in years, she felt light, unburdened, free. Darius stood by her side, his expression unreadable as they walked back through the forest. The weight of the past few hours hung between them, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had just shifted. She was no longer the silent bride. She was something new. Someone new. But as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Amara realized something else. Her freedom had come at a cost. Rhys. He would feel it. The bond had been severed, but the loss would not go unnoticed. The consequences of what she had done would reverberate throughout the pack, and Rhys would come for her. She knew that. But for the first time, she didn't fear him. She was free. And whatever came next, she would face it on her terms. Epilogue. The quiet after the storm. The sun rose gently over the distant hills, casting a warm glow that softened the raw edges of the previous night. The forest, once dark and filled with the heavy scent of tension and fear, now seemed to breathe with a new life, lighter, fresher, as if it too had been freed from the burden it had borne for so long. The birds chirped overhead, the breeze moved softly through the leaves, and Amara stood at the edge of the clearing, taking in the beauty of the world as it unfolded before her. It had been days since the bond was severed, days since she had taken her future into her own hands. Her heart, once shackled by Rhys's presence, and the expectations of her family, now felt lighter. The weight of her past had not disappeared, it would never fully leave her, but she had learned how to carry it. With each step, she moved further away from the life she had been forced to live and closer to the one she was now choosing for herself. Darius had kept his word, guiding her through the wilderness to a place of safety, though it was clear that he had his own motives. He had been the one to reveal the truth about her bloodline, about the power she held, about her ability to break the curse. In the end, he had offered her more than just freedom. He had given her the tools to reshape her destiny. But Amara knew that, like all things, the path ahead would not be without its trials. She had to prepare herself for the repercussions of her choices, for the life that lay ahead, for the conflict that would inevitably follow. Rhys would not let her go easily. He would come for her, for the pack. The rebellion had been a prelude, a warning of the dangers lurking in the world beyond their small fractured kingdom. But Amara was no longer afraid, not of him, not of the unknown. As she stood in the quiet of the morning, the wind rustling her hair, Amara felt a new sense of purpose settle deep within her chest. She wasn't just running anymore. She wasn't hiding from the truth or from Rhys's power. She had faced the darkness and had come out on the other side, free. She could hear Darius approaching, his footsteps soft against the forest floor. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She still wasn't sure about him, about his true intentions, about the path he had taken to lead her here. But for now, he was the only ally she had. "You've done it," Darius said quietly, his voice filled with something close to admiration. "You've broken the bond, it's over." Amara nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. She could feel the weight of his words, the finality of them. But they didn't give her the relief she thought they would. In fact, she felt a slight unease settle over her, as if she had stepped into a space where there was no going back. "I've done what I had to do," she replied, her voice steady. "But I don't know what comes next." Darius stood beside her, his eyes distant. "No one ever does." "Not really, but you're free to choose, that's all that matters." She looked at him then, searching his face for any hint of deceit, but all she saw was the same cold resolve that had marked his every action. He had helped her, yes, but there was still something about him that felt distant, like he wasn't fully invested in her cause. Or perhaps, like he had his own agenda all along. But Amara didn't have the luxury of questioning his motives right now. She had made a choice and she would stick by it. For better or worse. "I'm not sure what my future holds," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "But I know one thing. I'm not going to live in fear anymore." Darius glanced at her, his lips curling into something that resembled a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. Fear is what keeps people trapped. But it also keeps them alive. The trick is knowing when to let go of it." Amara didn't respond, her thoughts drifting as she stared out into the vast expanse of forest. The world was changing, and she was a part of that change. Rhys's world, the one she had once been a part of, was crumbling, just as she had known it would. He would come for her, but this time, she would be ready. She would no longer be the silent bride. She would no longer play the role that had been written for her. She would forge her own path, whatever it took. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Darius's gaze flickered toward her, and for the first time she saw something like a flicker of respect in his eyes. "We go wherever you choose, Amara. The world is wide, the future is yours to shape." Amara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. For the first time in her life, the world felt vast. It felt full of possibility. She wasn't bound to anyone, to any pack, to any man. She was free, but that freedom came at a cost. The pack, Rhys's pack, had been torn apart by her actions. The consequences of severing the bond between them would be far-reaching. Rhys would not be content to let her go so easily, and the pack's loyalty to him ran deep. She could feel it in her bones. This was only the beginning of a larger battle. But for now, as the dawn light broke over the trees, Amara allowed herself to breathe. She would face what came next when the time came. She had made her choice. She had taken control of her fate. And as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, she turned toward the horizon, her heart steady with the knowledge that the future was hers. Epilogue. A new dawn. The kingdom was changing. In the wake of the bond's destruction, Rhys had retreated to the shadows, his power faltering, his world crumbling around him. The pack, once united under his rule, had splintered into factions, each vying for control in the absence of their alpha. Rhys's reign was over, though his influence would never fully fade. He was still the king of the Lycans in many ways. But he was no longer the one in control. Amara had done what no one had thought possible. She had freed herself from the bond. That tied her to him, and in doing so, she had changed the course of history. But as the days passed, the consequences of her actions became clearer. The rebels, once a distant threat, now moved closer, their numbers growing as they saw the weakness in Rhys's pack. Amara knew that the true battle had only just begun. She wasn't ready to face it alone, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never again be silent. She would fight for her future, for the freedom she had earned, and for the life she had always wanted. The world was changing, and Amara would be the one to shape it. The storm was far from over, and she was ready for it.